Hello, this is John Spink. I'll be your instructor today. I am a director and assistant professor of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University. And this is my presentation, Global Challenges of Food Fraud and EMA Hazards and Preventive Controls at the IFT Annual Conference 2016 in session 14 on emerging tools and future trends. First off, we're Michigan State University. We're a university and we do a lot of teaching. What we do in our program is we try to provide a wide range of education or training resources, from very simple and free to full-blown academic programs. The first and foundational program we have is our MOOCs, Massive Open Online Course. And the one you'll see in the corner is our sixth, which happens to be co-branded with the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment. That's the Chinese government center that reviews and tests and monitors food fraud. So that MOOC itself was translated by CFSA team members, and it's available with subtitles. So our MOOC is offered about twice a year, usually in May and November. It's free, open, online, 2 2-hour webinars available to anyone worldwide. Second, we do executive education and short courses. These are on food fraud management and other types of vulnerability assessment workshops. Those are offered at Michigan State, and we're expanding to offer those around the country and around the world. Those are usually 2 days apiece, focused for industry. And then we have graduate courses. These are all online. They're real Michigan State graduate courses, 3 credits, and 100% online. We have anti-counterfeit and product protection, which is our primary food fraud course, and others that address food fraud in one way or another. If you take a number of those courses, 4 of them, you can receive a certificate in food fraud prevention. This is offered within our Master of Food Safety program at Michigan State, and again, that program is all online. Information is available there. First off, before getting started, I want to highlight an article that was published 2 days ago, or accepted 2 days ago, with another speaker from this panel at IFT, and then also another speaker from another panel at IFT. So Doug Moyer, our colleague here at Michigan State, was the lead author, and John DeVries was the second author. This was based on one of his previous presentations at USP, where we really saw an opportunity to expand on that concept, explaining the economic impacts of a food fraud incident, so we can understand more clearly and laid out in an academic sense where is the opportunity and why. So this was published just 2 days ago in Food Control, and that's a high impact journal, so that's significant that we'll be able to make an impact in the field. And then one thing that's interesting is including Doug, we've been involved with the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, and I'm on the expert panel. John has been the chair of the expert panel on food ingredient intentional adulteration, and I've also been on 2 others related to adulteration or fraud. John is formerly with Medallion Labs for General Mills. Doug is at Michigan State, and I'm also at Michigan State. So I just wanted to talk about that because it shows that we've got some very active research and publishing to make an impact in the field. Defining food fraud. Before we even get started, it's probably a good idea that we do some foundation setting. We find this is critical at the beginning of pretty much every meeting or every project, whether it's ISO, GFSI, Chinese food law, US, anywhere. It's important to set the foundation because many times there's confusion about what these terms actually are or what they cover. And if you find out on day 5 of a 10-day workshop, then there can be a lot of problems and rework. So first off, food fraud is deception using food for economic gain. This is broad, all types of fraud. This includes the FDA defined in the public record definition of economically motivated adulteration. And FDA specifically defined it as a substance for economic gain with a health hazard. So any deviation from using that term would be a deviation from FDA's own definition. And this broad definition of, using the term food fraud in the scope is consistent with Global Food Safety Initiative, the European Commission, the UK, ISO, China, and others. The motivation is economic gain. But before we go into that, we probably should review a couple other terms that apply in some sense or not so much. Food defense. Food defense more traditionally is harm or terror using food, broadly. But then we just had the preventive controls rule and the intentional adulteration rule for here in the US. We'll go into that in more detail, but intentional adulteration is a different term. Generally, the term is used for any substance purposely added for any reason. So that could be fraud, being economic, or it could be harm. So intentional adulteration generally covers all those topics. So if you talk about intentional adulteration, in general, it covers the broad topics, including harm. Intentional adulteration was defined later in the intentional adulteration rule for FSMA. So FDA's definition of FSMA, FDA's definition of intentional adulteration, and thus food defense, is specifically and explicitly a terrorist or large-scale attack for health harm. So this is kind of confusing because there's a lot of different terms being thrown around. One thing that has been convenient is to use food fraud as the core concept and then explain where food fraud deviates, or where a current project may deviate from that broad definition of food fraud. The effect, there's always an economic threat, whether it's a government not getting taxes, a retailer selling product that they think is something else, a consumer buying a product that they think is something else, or brand owners not making that sale, whether it's diluted or whether it's a pure counterfeit. The thing that's harder is public health, and with food agencies, we take a food safety risk-based approach, and with that approach, really food fraud falls far down the list in priority because the vast majority of food fraud incidents do not have a public health threat. They could have a catastrophic, colossal food economic impact. Companies can go out of business and do go out of business, but the public health threat might be low. So what we say is that there's not always a threat, but there is always a vulnerability. And that's a key word you'll hear more and more of, but a vulnerability, the potential for a problem. The horse meat incident in the UK did not have a public health threat, but it could have. And if that product, if the bad guys didn't use high quality horse meat and there was a problem, we couldn't have recalled it because we didn't know it was in the product. So that's a real key about the vulnerability. And that's why GFSI has focused more on vulnerabilities, and you'll hear about vulnerability assessments. And here's some other examples. We give copyright approval to use this, so screenshot it or pull it from a previous PDF of ours, and you can use this as a central definition if you have to explain this to other people. What is food fraud more broadly? This is based on the food safety, Global Food Safety Initiative, and GFSI is key because companies really must be GFSI compliant to engage in global commerce. So it's important to look at the background. This was from the GFSI's food fraud think tank, and Michigan State, we were one of 4 members on the core team, and then there were 6 total providing guidance to the GFSI board. So as you see, it covers all types of food fraud, even including gray market product. That's genuine product that's just sold in a different market. Same with theft. Probably overruns and tampering should be added in there because that is other types of fraud, either date code tampering or production that's not illegal production at a contract manufacturer. Up here is where the traditional Federal Register definition of food fraud covered. This is, I say, Federal Register definition by FDA. But really what we see more broadly is that this broad definition of food fraud is really what's used the UK, EU, GFSI, China, ISO, and others, and actually the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So even though we're talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 did not go away, and FDA is very clear and reminds us many times in the final rules that that's still in play, and that would be adulterated and misbranded foods, and that would be all types of product. That would include stolen goods, counterfeits, tampering, and others. And it does appear that the Preventive Controls Rule does cover this broad definition of food fraud that lead to hazards. We'll cover that in another slide. So first off, to jump into looking at hazards and preventive controls, it's important to look at what FDA is doing in the way of training. And actually earlier this week, as well as back at the Food Safety Summit, I taught the subchapter on economically motivated food safety hazards in the qualified individual training. So this is insight that's being presented at those training sessions, and actually FDA, they didn't attend the current sessions that we had, but they do attend sessions. If you're interested in that specific training, I've included a QR code here that you can read with your phone to link to a public YouTube video on the topic. So Before getting into the preventive controls rule, we'll look at the food defense and the intentional adulteration rule. This came out. We have a food fraud initiative report at Michigan State that goes into great detail, probably 15 to 20 pages long. So if you want the gory details, it's there. It was enacted in July, and the requirement will be in at least 3 years. So that's when it will be required by law to have it. Now, that doesn't mean that FDA won't look for this earlier, but that's when the guidance will be fully required. Future documents and training to provide more insight. We will find, such as at the qualified individual training, FDA will provide additional guidance documents, statements, reports. There will be qualified individual training for food defense, and there'll also be qualified individual training or inspector training for the agency inspectors. We will gain a lot of insight from that. So IA and possibly all food defense, the term for FDA, really it covers only this wide-scale human public health harm, does not include economic harm or psychological terror, so it's not food counterterrorism. All other intentional acts are out of scope, and that includes disgruntled employees, food fraud, EMA, malicious tampering, and others. It's important to look at the IA rule. FDA has made a lot of statements that you should not look at FSMA, these final rules specifically. You should look at them in total, that they all tell a story about the overall FSMA picture. So that was key in looking at the IA rule to see if there was any insight on things like risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, or others. So looking at then the preventive controls rule, it is required. Uniquely addressing food fraud and EMA that could lead to a public health hazard is a compliance requirement. All types. And a key, this was, if you didn't believe it, it was defined later explicitly in the IA rule. Health hazard that is economically motivated. That's different than the original definition of EMA that we saw with in the Federal Register by FDA. And the multiple rules talk about agents that could lead to a hazard, where that original agent was occurred because it was economically motivated. And specifically, as the second point there, the IA rule identified genuine stolen goods that had an agent that led to a hazard as covered, expected to be covered under this. So that could be stolen goods that leave your plant fit for commerce, mishandled by criminals. A microbe grows, creates a toxin, and that toxin is a health hazard. So they did specifically mention that. FSMA PC rule only defines compliance to this rule, not necessarily the food fraud aspects of other parts of FSMA. So there are other FSMA rules, such as foreign supplier verification or accredited third party. And actually, remember the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We won't go into detail here, but there's also other government laws, such as finance. That's Sarbanes-Oxley. One thing that's good is that it appears that current broad food fraud vulnerability assessment and food fraud prevention plan activities will lead to compliance with FSMA PC. That specifically for us is the Global Food Safety Initiative requirements. If you do pursue GFSI requirements, you probably will be compliant with FSMA. Actually, probably compliant with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as well. Briefly on GFSI Issue 7, the draft has been out and circulated for comments and returned. We were a part of that process. The final Issue 7 will come out later this year and be required in a year. That said, many of the auditors, the scheme owners or standards, are already requiring compliance to the food fraud aspects of this. 4 new clauses in the sections. Addressing food fraud is not optional. That's a key. That to be GFSI compliant, you have to do this. And so a key, what GFSI has done is they require a vulnerability assessment for all products, all types of fraud, for all products at your company. They also require a prevention plan for those products that you find to have a high vulnerability. Challenges of preventive controls. Preventing all food fraud. This is different. This is not general food science. If you're talking about stolen goods, diverted goods, counterfeit goods, it's amazing what we need. Country of origin, process, just confirming all that is very, very different. As is traceability, really these global commerce traceability laws. All compliance. So remember, even if you're head of the preventive controls rule team, your company is required to have compliance requirements across the board. Reducing recall potential and financial laws. There's more than just these public health threats. You need to do your job. And we can tell you that your CFO and board of directors care. A recall is a problem. And ultimately, this will probably fall under this overall food quality standards or food quality group. So be aware of that. Reducing liability. This is the bottom line. And this is for your company. The Food Safety Modernization Act is supposed to increase consumer confidence through the product being safer in the U.S. But really for yourself, it's reduced liability. It's corporate, legal, regulatory, and criminal. There's criminal liability here. If you know of smuggled product, that could be a criminal act by you for aiding and abetting. It's for executives, employees, and you. We have a lot of different ways you can engage with us at Michigan State, so please see our website. A lot of people mentioned to be very thankful of, and USP has been a great partner, as well as the specific individuals here. With that, I'll take questions. Thank you.